Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's iteration of ODI Fridays. My name is James, and I'm a senior consultant at the Open Data Institute. Our guest speaker today is a fellow colleague of mine, Dr. John Burton. John has had a very varied career, but the main theme of his work has always been involving investigating complex data sets to find real value for people. And at the ODI, John's role partly includes leading our work on embedding data ethics practices within organizations. Today's lecture will provide some context to the ODI's data ethics work and describe what we are currently doing and plan to do in the future to help organizations become more ethical with data. Before handing over to John, can I please ask that all participants make sure that their microphones stay on mute and that their cameras are off during the presentation. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. If you do want to ask something, then please submit your question using the chat function. And after the presentation, I'll ask people one by one to unmute and ask their questions. I'd also like to remind you that we are recording this session. Once again, thank you for joining us today. And now I'll hand over to John for his presentation.
Thank you ever so much, James. Just want to do the thing where I check that I'm not on mute. I think that's fine. So there we go. Yeah, thank you for the wonderful introduction, and really happy to be here. And thank you for allowing me to come and present some of the work that we've been doing on data ethics practices as of late. Just to give a brief sort of structure to this session, I'll be discussing what is data ethics. I'm sure a lot of people are already aware of it, but it's always good to sort of introduce the concept as well, just to make sure we're all on an equal footing. And then I'm going to go into some of the recent work that we've been doing as part of the data ethics piece at the ODI. And then I'm going to mention and encourage people to get involved with that work. And I'll share details of how to do that towards the end of this session. And then any questions that people want to ask, I definitely encourage that. As James said, please feel free to put them in the chat. So, a very brief introduction, since James already provided a fantastic introduction. My name's John. I've been working in data for about 15 years now, starting in academia in astrophysics. I've worked in data science and AI, in skills development and all things to do with data, really. I'm the one with the beard on the picture, by the way. You can probably tell with this, but still. Yeah, really being able to find out what value there is in data for whoever the end users are, for organisations that have generated the data. That's really what is my main passion when it comes to my career. And the opportunity to work with the Open Data Institute, an organisation I've been following for years now, was a real honour, and I'm so happy to be here and so happy to be leading on something that's very close to my heart as well. Ratio, we'll crack on. Also, I bake a lot. If anyone would like a cake, get in contact, and I'll knock you up one for your special event. So yeah, what is data ethics? Some of this material has been taken from the data ethics practitioner course. There's some fantastic examples in there, and some fantastic case studies and summations of what we mean when we use the term data ethics. There's a lot of ambiguity around data ethics, around what that actually means and what ethical data practices are. And even within the ODI's definitions, there's been a little bit of tweaking and altering to try and get to a robust definition of what data ethics actually means. And the most recent one the ODI has landed on is this. So a branch of ethics that evaluates data practices with the potential to create both trustworthy and positive impacts, and also adversely impacts on people and society. That is in all branches of data collection, sharing and use. And what this means essentially is that the ethical data practices can have a positive impact on people. It can have a positive impact on society or the particular cohort of individuals that your data is reflecting. It can also have a negative impact. I'll get into some areas which touch on both of those in a moment. But effectively, data ethics should be using data and should be using the practices and analysis ultimately for good, whatever that means and whatever context that is. Again, a very general definition, but it's one at least we can start with and then tailor to different situations and nuances and businesses and applications and all sorts of things. The Turing Institute has a really good definition of data ethics as well, which I've left in the references for these slides. So definitely recommend going and checking that out as well. But for the purposes of this talk, and for the purposes of the next 20 minutes or so, this will be the definition that I'll use for data ethics. Again, this is an example that was borrowed from the ODI's data ethics practitioners course. Hopefully everyone's familiar with the trolley problem. If you're not, I'll give you a quick summary. So say there's a runaway trolley represented by the red, very blocky looking trolley on that. You can tell a scientist has designed this slide. But essentially, there's a runaway trolley and one person is in charge of the lever which will divert the track or not. If the trolley was to stay on the track that it's currently on, it would injure one person. If the lever was to be pulled, it would be diverted and injure many people. So that's been a philosophical problem for millennia now. Since the days of Plato, this has been fiercely debated. What would an individual do? Is one life always worth more than many lives? And it's an impossible thing to answer, quite frankly. The nearest that this has come to a solution has been that, well, you never really know what you do until you're put in that situation. And that is really capturing the issue when it comes to ethics in general. Now, where this crosses over the line into data ethics is that self-driving cars are now a thing. They exist in the world, they're being tested. There's various different companies that have launched self-driving vehicles. And ultimately, given the amount of sensors that are being added onto the cars, given the amount of data that's being collected, it means that eventually the trolley problem will have to be put into code. Because it's not going to be a philosophical problem anymore. It's going to enter the realms of essentially programming, because ultimately someone has to decide if a car loses control, loses brakes, and it can detect that it will injure one person in the scenario, or it'll injure many people in the scenario. Which does it do? Does it prioritize the car's occupants, or does it prioritize the people on the street? That is ultimately now becoming a real thing that people who are coding have to deal with. Essentially, is the next generation of Teslas? Is it an altruist or is it an egoist? Does it save the people in the car? Does it save people outside the car? Is that a user setting? Can the user choose whether your car's altruistic or not? These are real now, becoming real, out of the realms of thought problems and out of the realms of philosophy into real tangible examples that we have to deal with. And this is one that I think will be a future problem. There's an excellent book called 21 Problems for the 21st Century by Yuval Harari. I'll link that, all the resources I've used in the chat, as well as on this presentation at the end. But that describes in detail about how the world of AI, the world of automation, the world of increasing data is absolutely fraught with these ethical challenges. And there are a lot of examples where organizations have behaved poorly or behaved unethically based on the data that they're either collecting or using or analyzing. And there's a lot of examples that show that data ethics is a field that needs to be put to the forefront to maintain customer and to maintain trust in different organizations. A particular example of that that's actually happened, as opposed to a problem that will be coming up in a few years, is Cambridge Analytica. Again, this is taken from the ODI's course on data ethics, and it's a great example of when there was clearly an unethical amount of behaviour when it came to data. So back in 2014, an app was created by Global Science Research. Essentially, it's a personality quiz. People downloaded it, people used it on the phones to link their Facebook accounts to it, and it captured their data. And I'm sure we've all used apps on our phones that link you to Facebook, and you make the agreement that, yes, I agree that there's some data of mine that gets used so I can use this app. However, initially only 270,000 users downloaded the app, and that was a cap on how many could have given their permission to use the data. However, 30 to 80 million profiles were captured in terms of information, and that is quite a serious difference in allowing users to make a choice or not. And that is definitely in the realms of ethics and how organisations are actually capturing and using this data when you've never given any user permission, and there's a lot of things that could be done that have potentially negative impacts on it. Things like the US election results and the fake accounts that we use to influence people. All this kind of stuff is based on data, and it's based on how it's used. And I'll get onto sort of regulations in a moment as well, but regulation is an attempt to add in some structure around potentially around some ethical issues, but ultimately ethics and regulation are two different things, and I think that's something that needs to be resolved in the work going forward as well. There's a difference between something like GDPR and how you ethically use data. Again, this was very much a negative example, and the potential for negativity and the disadvantaging people or people with protected characteristics. Certainly the potential for that to happen is increasing in this world. Something like China with its facial recognition technology has the ability to know information about different minorities, such as the Uyghur minority. The potential there and what that could be used for obviously has a big implication for ethics. On the other hand, there's an element of ethical choices, are the best ethical decision, I should say, coming from people actually being able to use the data. So I once did a project with the University of Leeds, which was around early intervention in cancer patients. So essentially, by using a whole load of patient data, you could essentially build up a profile of some of the early signs of different kinds of cancer that would be missed by clinicians. And really, there's so much data there. I mean, millions of patient profiles and diagnostic tests and every sort of different element of data that was available within the study. That could essentially mean that treatment could start earlier, be much more cost effective for the NHS, be much more effective for the patients, be much less invasive with having to go to more extreme levels of treatment. And I, for one, will be happy for my data to be used in a situation like that. I have no issue with any of my information being used to do something which I see is very helpful to society. And that's the dichotomy now. A lot of people defer, or in their minds defer to the negative, like Cambridge Analytica, like facial recognition and potentially racial profiling. But then there is also the positive side of it as well, and the projects that really need data to be able to get the most benefit for society. So it's a very tricky area, but it's one I think that there's a general recognition that there needs more focus on it. So essentially, just a summation, there's a lot more of things going on. There's a lot more algorithms, a lot more data, more automation, and ultimately more regulation as well. And for the reasons described, being ethical is not really related to any of those, but it is impacted by all of these areas. So ultimately, ethics is about doing the right thing. And obviously, that's going to change depending on different contexts, depending on cultures. It's going to be quite malleable. But in general, it is about doing what is seen as the right thing more than anything else. And it can often be very tricky. The ODI has done a lot of work in supporting individual projects, people and teams in their endeavours to become more data ethics ready or more data ethics savvy with something like the data ethics canvas. So this is, again, hopefully something that people are familiar with. And again, this is a resource that's captured as part of the references for this presentation. Essentially, that probes a number of different areas when it comes to projects that are using data to actually determine how there could be improvements made for data ethics within that project. So things like how you're getting the data, how you're capturing it, the reason for using it, how it's being communicated to users, how you're engaging with people, how open you are, and what actions you can take to minimise the negative impacts on people and maximise the positive impacts on people as well. This work, again, is something that the ODI's courses are built around, and this is available. This is, as a resource, is available to people from the ODI website. And there was a lot of engagement and a lot of interest on this in particular. And the ODI wanted to focus on data ethics specifically, using the canvas as kind of a jumping off point, but then essentially find out how we could go from just a project or just an individual level to doing this throughout organisations. And that's the area of work that James has been focusing on in the recent few weeks that I've been focusing on. Yeah, that's the next step for the ODI. And that's what I'll get into now, and some of the results that we've seen in the project around embedding data ethics in organisations. Or if you feel like using the word, operationalising data ethics. I hate that word, so I'm not going to use it again, but I know that some people do like it, so there we go. So yeah, as mentioned, some of the recent work under the data assurance programme. Data assurance programme consists of 4 main strands, data ethics being one, strategy, trustworthy practices, and trustworthy data sets being the others. There's all different projects at different stages that are working on these different areas. Again, data ethics is been the main focus for me since I joined the ODI, and James before me as well. And as part of this work, it's been fantastic to be able to see how people are thinking about ethics within their organisation. So yeah, one of the main issues, or one of the main challenges that the previous work on data ethics has found, is how do you get more people within organisations talking about data ethics? How do you go from one person who's really interested and enthusiastic about data ethics? How do you go from that model to the CEO and exec team meetings having agenda items for that? How do you go to a data ethics committee? How do you really make the most value out of data ethics and get it embedded in the places it needs to be taken basically on the same level as GDPR is taken, the same level as data protection, the same level as employee wellbeing as well, because this is something that does affect both sort of employees of organisations and their customers and users as well. So a data ethics maturity model has been developed. What I'm about to show you essentially is just a very stripped back version, and anyone who wants to find out more about some of the content that we developed for this, I'll encourage you to get in touch. I'll relay that message again at the end of the slides. But essentially, this is a very, very simplified version of the maturity model. So we've got 5 scales, or 5 points on a scale at the top there: initial, repeatable, defined, managed, and optimized. And then 6 themes. So in case it's a little bit small on your screen, those are organizational governance and internal oversight, skills and knowledge, data management processes, financial processes, customer and staff engagement, and legal standing and compliance. So these are areas that have been investigated in various different literature reviews and user research sessions, and from initial findings, these were determined as quite important areas for organisations to focus on to really embed data ethics throughout their organisation. So obviously things like having a governance structure around ethics, increasing people's skills and knowledge, having really robust data management processes and financial processes which support data ethics. These are all things that aren't, they don't exist in a vacuum. Data management processes will obviously cross over with something like data protection, cross over with the governance arrangements of data within an organisation. And really it's about seeing what processes already exist and how they can be iterated, or in some cases overhauled, to make them more data ethically led. And obviously the customer and staff engagement is about communicating what you're doing in relation to data ethics, and legal standing and compliance, obviously around GDPR and any data protection regulation that exists as well as any potential breaches or other things, events that may happen as well. So these essentially are the themes and the points on the scale where different areas can measure themselves in terms of a maturity rating. Just so you can see it a little better, I've pulled the scale out here so you can see roughly 1 to 5, where does an organisation sit on the scale? So that is the work that's been going on. Obviously, I've missed a lot out there in terms of development, but the sort of content that's been produced about how you define yourself a 1 around customer and staff engagement, a lot of content exists to guide organisations to understand what that actually means. And again, I would encourage people who want to get involved, you can share that version with you, and you can feedback on what your thoughts are around the content that exists in that as well. Fortunately, over the past couple of weeks, we've been able to test this with users. So I'm going to present now some very, very initial user research findings. We'll caveat this with user research will be ongoing for at least the next month or so around the data ethics maturity model. So this is all just a snapshot of what we're finding, and these may change in the coming weeks and months. But essentially, so far, the findings from users have been quite robust, and there's some themes that are emerging that are quite strong. And those themes so far are these 4. So data ethics are complicated, as in there's a great deal of differences in understanding about what data ethics actually means. A lot of people tend to defer to it being a regulation issue or it being GDPR related, which it isn't. There's a deal of difference there. Support being needed to get data ethics on a corporate agenda, and data ethics tend to come from specific evangelists within the organisation. Those 2 are related, and essentially what we tend to find is that the people we're talking to tend to be within teams who have taken it on themselves to embed data ethics more widely, whether it's in their team or whether it's trying to get it into a data strategy, whether it's trying to get it up to the exec team. There's a feeling that this needs to be escalated, but how that's best done and the support that's actually needed to do that, that is something that we're investigating at the minute. And finally, the maturity model so far has been well received, but it seems to be it's well received, but there'll also need to be a level of support around that as well. So essentially, it's 1 tool of a few that could be really useful for making data ethics an actual embedded part of an organisation. And that's again something that the ODI is looking at. We'll be looking at in the next couple of months. Just in relation to these and how we're going to elaborate on in the future, I've given a very rough indication of the next steps. Again, these are all kind of subject to change, but essentially further user research, workshops and product development are the main 3 that are going to be coming up in the short term. I've also included an article there just on the left, which is written about this process, which has got a few more details about essentially it's this talk, but just in a written format, basically. So I definitely encourage people to check that out as well. There's some details about how you can get involved in some of the user research, some if you've got any opinions or thoughts on how you embed data ethics, I definitely recommend having a read of that article as well. So that at the minute is all from me. I've left my email address there, and I would encourage any questions, any thoughts that people have. If you'd like to see a content-filled version of the maturity model, I'll happily send that out with a little form for some feedback. But essentially, I'm really quite enthused by how people are considering data ethics now in the users that we've talked to. And for me, it's just about making sure that it's a complicated issue, and it will be something that I think will require a lot of deliberation and back and forth to get things in a really good state on a more general societal level. But I think this is where that work starts, and already we're on good footing for that. So yeah, I just recommend and encourage people to get involved in the conversation. So if anyone wants to get in contact with me and wants to chat about this sort of stuff, more than happy to set some time up and have a conversation with you. I'll stop sharing my screen now, just so we can see each other. And I think James is going to do the questions, if that's right.
Yes, thank you, John. Really, really interesting presentation. Obviously, I have to say that because I've been involved in the work as well. But no, definitely something very interesting from my perspective. Apologies, I'm having some issues with accessing the chat because my Zoom's gone all funny. So it might be easier, John, if you read the questions off and answer them.
Yeah, of course, that's fine. So I've got a chat on this screen here. So I'll just close that. Here we go. So this is from Jerry. How do we overcome the inherent subjectivity of ethics from a governance perspective? I now have colleagues in Texas who think it's entirely ethical to refuse a 14-year-old rape victim an abortion. Largely, we don't take that view in the UK. The thought is, don't do harm means different things to different cultures. Yeah, that's an excellent point, Jerry. I think that, as mentioned, the sort of cultural aspect of ethics is, regardless of whether it's related to data or not, is a hugely variable thing over different areas of the world, over different societies, over different stratas within societies, over different backgrounds and cultures. I think that the idea of taking it back really simple and minimizing the harm on people and maximizing the good or the benefits that they can experience, that's definitely at the forefront of the ODI's way of thinking. I think there always will be that inherent subjectivity when it comes to ethics. I don't think there's an easy way around that. I think there's value in having conversations with people and trying to understand why people think the way they do when it comes to ethical considerations. I just think in general it's a very it can get quite a messy issue, and I think within certain areas of society and particularly within the UK, we can probably get to a fairly uniform understanding of what data ethics is as a discipline. However, that won't necessarily be universal, and it won't necessarily be applicable to every part of, or every strata of society, and even in this country, or even cities, or even specific areas within a country. So I think there's being open and willing to have a conversation and listen to people. I think that's where we start to maybe not break those barriers down, but at least start to try to maximize the good where possible. I hope that was okay. So Julia, can you say more about the methodology user engagement feedback? Absolutely. So we've taken the users we've actually been talking to in user research sessions. We've reached out to people who've come on the data ethics practitioner course from the ODI. Now, obviously, that means that we're talking to people who are already engaged with data ethics. We understand that, and we understand that, yeah, there'll be a bias that they probably are engaged and invested in data ethics. Really interesting, though, there's a lot of differences in opinion about what data ethics actually is, even within the group who are already interested in it. There's also a very mixed bag of situations that people are in, as in, does their organisation care? Does their organisation understand what data ethics is? That's very variable. Some it's like, yes, they do, but it's not a priority. Others is just like, no, they don't care at all. So even within the users that we're talking about that have an interest already in data ethics, there's an awful lot of variability. In another way, we're reaching out to people who have worked with the ODI in the past, just to show some of the content within the model that I showed earlier, and getting a feedback via a short survey as well. So I think there's value in both of those, and sitting down and talking through the model with people, but also getting them to see it filled in, see some of the different areas and the specifics within organisations that we're starting to point out. So yeah, a couple of different areas that we're exploring there, and as I say, we'll be recruiting people as well for the next round of user feedback when we iterate the model as well. So hopefully that was all right. And again, if you'd like to get involved, please get in contact with me or anyone at the ODI, and it will get through to myself, and we'll be able to set something up, or send you the model and the form as well. Great stuff. Thank you so much. All from Tim. Organisations tend to filter out information they view as unfavourable. I myself was filtered out and terminated from a volunteer position when raising questions about data ethics there. Can the ODI assist individuals to pursue reforms? And if so, in what type of ways? That's an excellent question, and it does demonstrate that the sort of, if an organisation isn't comfortable that what they're doing is ethically the right thing to do, I think that there can be examples, as you mentioned, Tim, just around, being shut that information out, and don't talk about it. This is what we're doing. It's fine. Just leave it. I would want the ODI to be a champion of that reform aspect of things, and certainly by demonstrating why ethics and ethics related data are so important. I think that's something that will hopefully come about with time, working with people, working with organisations to actually make them see the value, and why this is, as I say, should be viewed as just as important as employee wellbeing or GDPR or anything like that. So I would want the ODI to certainly be a champion of data ethics, and assisting individuals to pursue reforms. I think there may be a degree of resistance from certain organisations and certain parts of organisations, because it can be quite a difficult thing, is showing where there could be improvement. But I think that is, by necessity, we'll probably have to have those kind of difficult conversations. So I certainly would want the ODI to be a voice in that. Yes. That's all from the chat. James, did you have anything else?
No, hopefully everyone can see me and hear me, because I think my Zoom is semi-crashed, so I'm hoping that doesn't affect the recording. If there aren't any more questions, and I've also logged on my phone to look at the chat, it doesn't seem like there are, then I think we can wrap up. I'd like to say one final thank you to John for a brilliant presentation. Please do get in touch with him or myself if you want to learn more about what the ODI is doing around data ethics, or if you want to make suggestions about areas where we might want to explore something further, because we do have a real commitment to trying to make sure that the ODI's kind of portfolio around data ethics is useful and really serves the needs of people. So really interested in hearing from you all. Our next Friday lunchtime lecture next week will be presented by Martin Boyd and Sebastian O'Kelly of the charity The Leasehold Knowledge Partnership. They'll be talking about data and dealing with building safety crises. Thank you to all of you for joining us today, and I hope you have a lovely weekend.